I've spent a number of nervous hours sitting in courtrooms with families who came to witness their sons being condemned to long sentences in federal prisons for the crime of having viewed child pornography on the computers in their bedrooms. Most of these young men were either bipolar or on the autism spectrum, mental conditions which affect their impulse control, their socialization, and their decision-making. And yet I have heard prosecutors passionately pleading that the defendant's mental condition should not be considered. I've heard prosecutors call these young men animals and dogs who deserve 15 to 25 years in prison. Once, when a mother sitting next to me was overcome with grief at the vicious words of the state's attorney and involuntarily let out a gasp, the prosecutor turned and pointed to the parents and said, "And I would have the parents serving in prison with them for letting this happen." Now, I'm not defending what they did, nor am I in any way defending actual sex offenders. But these young men that I've gone to court with hadn't had sex with anybody, let alone a child, never touched a child, never paid for or produced pornography. They did, however, allow their libidinal curiosity to lead them down a bad path, and they're paying a heavy price for it, a price of more than half of their adult life being spent in prison. And when they get out, they'll still be felons with very limited job opportunities and even relatively few places where they can live. The laws are such that can't live within so many yards of a school or a daycare center or a church or whatever. So many cities actually have homeless encampments of people that are on the sex offender list who are living under bridges and at the edges of industrial parts of town in order to not be found guilty of breaking those laws. So I'd like to encourage you to compare that with the conversation our current president had with Howard Stern on a 2005 radio show in which he bragged about walking into the dressing room of underage beauty contestants in order to see these teenage girls naked. He said, "Before a show, I'll go backstage and everyone's getting dressed and everything else, and no men anywhere, and I'm allowed to go in because I own the pageant, and therefore I'm inspecting it," he said. "I'm inspecting because I want to make sure everything is good. They're standing there with no clothes, and you see these incredible looking women, and so I sort of get away with things like that." Folks, this morning there are 100,000 men in prison who have committed sex crimes that in any rational context are not as egregious as what Donald Trump not only confessed to doing, but bragged about doing on a national radio show. I would even go so far as to speculate that many of those 100,000 men, in spite of their mental health issues and crimes, would be better presidents than Donald Trump. But that's just my opinion. I could be wrong. We Americans like to think that our judicial system, despite all of its flaws, is better than the judicial system in most other countries. We're America, right? But if our judicial system is better than other countries, then why is our incarceration rate so high? And I even printed this in your bulletin so you can take it home with you and see. All of these other countries are countries that are in an organization of economic cooperation with us, but you see countries that you would think would have a much higher rate of imprisonment, but the United States, we've got a couple of million people in prison and 6 million on parole. That doesn't look like it's working well to me. The hard truth is that our political and judicial systems are corrupt. I am not afraid to use that word. They are not a little bit corrupt. They are profoundly corrupt. Why is Donald Trump in the White House and 2 million Americans who have committed fewer and less serious crimes than he are in prisons and jails or on parole all over our nation? For the benefit of our podcast listeners who don't get to see the pictures, may I ask you to just say it out loud. Why is Donald Trump in the White House and these other men are in prison? Money, and not a small amount of money either. Our system is corrupt in several ways. Clearly, brown and black people walk into a courtroom with a serious disadvantage over other defendants. But of the people whom I personally know who are in federal prison for sex offenses, they are all white men from middle-class families. One family that's in the support group for whom I serve as chaplain literally wiped out their family's assets, spending more than $100,000 in defense of their son, and it did not make one day of difference in the sentence that he received. Because in this universe, $100,000 is nothing. Now, there was a story in our local paper this past week about a 75-year-old man in Branson who was found guilty of possessing child pornography. And these numbers are sometimes just remarkable, but on his computer, he had 174,000 sexual images of children. He had over 5,000, or nearly 5,000, videos, including children as young as 5 years old engaged in sex acts. But he is a friend of a local billionaire, Pete Herschend. And Pete Herschend showed up in court. And he goes to our local Six Flags Over Jesus Church, James River Assembly. And one of the pastors showed up and said that he was receiving treatment at James River Assembly of God. And so Judge Doug Harpool sentenced him to only 5 years in prison. Now, I've known Doug for 25 years now. I wrote to him earlier this year on behalf of a 19-year-old man who has Asperger's, who did not have 1% as much pornography on his computer as this man in Branson did. But Doug said that he had to follow mandatory minimum sentencing laws in the case of this kid. So he's spending 15 years in prison. The reason Judge Harpool gave in his newspaper report for this short sentence was in consideration of the age of the defendant. But I wrote to Judge Harpool last year about an 80-year-old man from Bolivar who was appearing in his court under the charge of having grown marijuana. And this man had been in the county jail for 3 years, was horribly ill, and literally near death. And Judge Harpool said that he had to follow the minimum sentencing guidelines and sent this sick old man to a certain death in federal prison over a 20-year sentence. Apparently, letters from me don't mean much to Judge Harpool. And though he says that the age of the defendant in a sex offender case mattered, it sure didn't matter in the case of this harmless old marijuana farmer. Could it be having billionaire friends that makes the difference? Could it be the money? It's the money, isn't it? Yeah. It's the money. The law doesn't apply to you as severely if Pete Herschend shows up in court to announce that you are a good guy who just happens to have 174,000 images of children in sexual circumstances and 5,000 videos. Now, I'm not saying that Mr. Walker should be in prison longer than 5 years. I'm not sure what anybody learns from being in prison for more than a year or two. Americans are addicted to long prison sentences, and that's why the statistics are so outrageous in our case, that if someone needs to learn a lesson, most people could get that figured out a lot faster than 15 or 20 years. I don't begrudge the fact that he got a 5-year sentence. What has made me furious is that these young men who have very legitimate mental health reasons for having made the mistakes that they made, they just happen not to have billionaire friends. And maybe they've got enough self-respect to not go to James River Assembly of God. I understand that may seem a little bit mean, but you know, let's be honest. At that church, the pastors and most of the members not only believe in the existence of angels, which is dubious enough, but they believe that they speak the language of those angels. This is called glossolalia. It's not in the DSM-6, but in previous iterations of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, glossolalia is listed as diagnostic criteria of schizophrenia. I would say that people, and they know they're faking. They know they're not speaking the secret language of angels. They know it's just an act. If they don't know it's just an act, they need medication and therapy. But they sure don't need to be giving therapy to other people. If you are not oriented to reality, you should not be a therapist. Now, I could talk all day about corruption in our judicial system. In fact, I would kind of like to. But folks, it's not just there. I've sat in the boardroom at Cox Hospital where plaques on the wall declare that they are a Christian medical facility. And I've had to listen in that boardroom to conversations about incorporating their for-profit insurance company offshore on a Caribbean island so that they wouldn't have to be subject to American oversight of their use of nonprofit assets to create for-profit insurance companies through which they pay themselves millions of dollars. And I look around the table at local business owners who have made themselves multimillionaires by awarding themselves contracts for services to the hospital without even going through a bidding process. Board members get business contracts with the hospital at any price they name. Now, if one of you goes out and steals a loaf of bread at a local grocery store to feed your hungry children, you may go to jail. If you unethically take hundreds of millions of dollars out of our local hospitals, they are more likely to name a wing after you and put your statue up in the entryway than they are to charge you with a crime. And if you commit multiple sex crimes against teenage girls, as Donald Trump certainly has, you might get to be the next president of the United States if you are rich enough. Our politicians are largely controlled by their super wealthy political donors. Our court system is corrupted by decisions that are based on race, class, political connections, and whoever's palms have been greased the most in the process. As one author has said, the judicial system doesn't decide who's right and who's wrong. It decides who can pay their attorney the longest. Our healthcare system, our penal system, and even the Federal Communications Commission are organized to serve the wealthy and the powerful, and most of the rest of us are just the serfs who serve the financial interests, not of the top 1%, but of the 0.1%. Now, folks, the number one thing in my job description is to stand up in public and tell the truth. And not just any truth. And lots of pastors that would say they're telling the truth, but they tell truth about history lessons. Long ago when Jesus, they tell the truth about things that don't matter. But if you want to tell the truth in the context of a spiritual community, you have to tell truths that oppressors don't want said. Same thing I've said to multiple editors at the newspaper. Journalism happens when you print something that somebody doesn't want you to print. Everything else is just advertising. If you're not writing something as a journalist that there's not someone that desperately wishes you wouldn't write, it's not a newspaper. So if you couldn't tell already, I showed up for work today. But I haven't said anything that most of you don't already know to be true, something you don't feel every day. The world is unjust, and the rich have a wholly unfair advantage over the rest of us. And maybe everything I have to say today could be built into a case for an open revolution in America. But before we talk about a revolution, I want to take you back to this hallway in the courthouse. As I said, I've spent a lot of hours sitting with families, oftentimes with church members, waiting for their time in court. It gets crowded, and you can't help but hear the complaints of people who are there for drunk driving charges, drug possession, for domestic violence, and more than anything else, for divorce and child custody hearings. A local attorney told me once that 90 cents out of every dollar paid to a lawyer in Greene County is paid for work on family issues, domestic violence, divorce, child custody. And that's a lot of money. And what I want to argue today is that that's money that you should avoid getting yourself into a situation where you have to pay it. I don't want to make light of this in any way, but let me remind you of that old 1970s TV show, Hee Haw. When someone would go to the doctor on Hee Haw and say, "Hey, doc, I broke my arm in 3 places," he would hit him with a rubber chicken and say, "Well, stay out of those places." Now, again, I'm the last person on earth who wants to make light of this topic, or to blame the victims, or to be dismissive of corruption in government, corporations, healthcare, or the judiciary. But I will say that it is possible to live in a way that generally avoids putting your children's future into the hands of a judge that doesn't have to care about your kid. That you can avoid putting your life and your freedom into the hands of a system that I'm standing up here telling you today is corrupt and does not care about you or your future. I'm sure that you've heard about black fathers giving the talk to their sons, giving them the painful but important advice about what it means to be black in America, what it means when the police lights come on behind you, when holding your hands up in surrender can still get you shot, when submitting peacefully to arrest can get you shot, when simply being put in the back of a police van can get you killed, or submitting and going into the police holding area can get you beaten to death. The talk is not intended to be acquiescence to an unjust world. It's not acceptance. It's not surrender. It's about survival. Now, ours is a racially diverse but still majority white congregation, just as the community where we live is still about 95% white. So most of the people that I go to court with are not minorities. Still, the injustice in America is not always racial. A lot of times it's economic. It's a class division. So consider this to be my talk with black, with brown, and with white folk. Do what you can to avoid confrontations with the police. Do not depend on them to be on your side or to do the right thing. Try to stay out of court. I guarantee you there is not much justice in our justice system. Do not assume that the healthcare system or even American democracy will step in and save you from your own bad choices. In fact, it is best to assume that it will not. Prison sentences for drug abuse is crazy. It's wrong. Addicts need treatment, not punishment. Still, avoid buying, using, or selling heroin, meth, or fentanyl. I'm just telling you, don't start. Please. Family court in divorce and child custody cases can be insane, but please strive to avoid living with, marrying, or having children with abusive or unstable partners. It doesn't end well. And for goodness sake, don't drink and drive. Folks, there are websites you can look up on your phone. You put in your gender, your weight, and how much you've had to drink, and it will tell you whether you need to call Uber or not. Don't try to save 15 bucks by driving home. This doesn't have to lead to a disastrous abdication of your rights and your freedoms. Now, addiction tends to get worse. That's one of the things that I learned in working in addiction treatment, is that you think the problem will go away, but in almost every case, it gets worse and it becomes lethal. Alcoholism is a progressive disease. Spouse abuse tends to get worse. Going back after multiple promises, it'll be better, it'll be better, it'll be better. Usually, it actually gets worse and oftentimes ends in murder. Porn addictions tend to get worse. Don't give in, and don't try to get help at James River Assembly of God. You know what I mean. I realize that you may think that I'm entirely ignoring our wisdom lesson today, but really I'm not. It's related. I don't often defer to Jewish and Christian scriptures these days, but I took our wisdom lesson from the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, the book of Proverbs. If you read Proverbs the way that they were written, not as words from God written by a divine finger, but more as sage wisdom passed on from an experienced and wise person to a new generation, what you find there is just advice about how to live a decent life. You always have to qualify that with being advice from a culture that is removed from us, both by continents and dozens of centuries. But still, a lot of it is basically a very humanist look at how to live in such a way that you keep yourselves out of the clutches of a corrupt government, a corrupt judicial system, or an absurdly disappointing healthcare system. The writer of Proverbs personifies wisdom as a woman who is literally calling out to those who are tempted to follow a wayward path towards drug or alcohol abuse, towards pornography, or a host of unhealthy habits, which you have to admit can also be eating junk food, not exercising, or not physically taking care of yourself. So wisdom calls out to the foolish to come home and have dinner and act like a grown-up. Just take charge of your own life. Recognize that you are powerful and you can make decisions that keep you out of the clutches of a corrupt system. Now, I want prison reform. It's one of the things, if I could clone myself, I wish I could work full-time on prison reform. I want judicial reform. But until we get that, I want you to stay out of the courthouse. I want a massively better program for addiction and alcohol treatment programs in this country, but we don't have that right now. So I am forced to quote my elementary school counselor, Mr. Mackey. Drugs are bad, okay? So don't do drugs. Now, I understand that most people use drugs and alcohol to self-medicate. And believe me, since the November election in 2016, I have had to reach for the anesthesia more than once. No one follows their curiosity upstream to look at illegal porn in order to become an addict who one day has their house surrounded by a SWAT team that breaks down the front door and the back door at the same time, where uniformed policemen come in and take every computer, tablet, and smartphone out of the house. But I can tell you that it happens, and it happens thousands of times a year. It's just not a path that you want to go down. What often starts as celebration with friends or a needed release from bad news ends up in a jail cell. Addictions tend to escalate, but the good news is there is a program that can restore you to sanity, and their meetings are free. They're open to anyone who's ready to leave crazy town. Just live in a way so that you stay out of the back seat of a police cruiser or in the hallway outside of a courtroom. No one's perfect. Everyone makes mistakes. And when you are in trouble, you know that I'm going to be on your side. But before we get to that point, let me tell you, the justice system isn't fair. The penal system is crazy corrupt. And nonprofit hospitals will take everything you own under the guise of helping you. We want to work together to make the world a better place, but recognizing the serious holes in the fabric of society, please choose to follow the way of wisdom. Live in a way that does not surrender your freedom to the whims of lawyers, judges, or insurance executives.
Now, as I was saying, drugs are bad. You shouldn't do drugs. If you do them, you're bad. Because drugs are bad, okay? It's a bad thing to do drugs, so don't be bad by doing drugs, okay? That'd be bad. Drugs are bad.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.